were you there when we had this big discussion about, well, I think we finally understood what Stephen means by the base layer. Did you have that?
Yeah, I think, yeah. Yeah, I don't even know if I could summarize it, but I've seen a lot of those discussions, and I think I'm coming to the same kind of intuition of where the differences are and what that understanding is. His is kind of like one without any curation or anything, and it's just storing the arguments. No, not even formalization, right?
There's that.
It's kind of like Jamie's first step in her process.
Very similar, yeah.
The thing that did persuade me, but I don't think it's the whole of his argument, is that there can be a lot of disagreement about how to formalize the relationship between the arguments, or the let's say the premises of a support.
Yeah, right.
And if we can just list them and have a linguistic, non-formal version of how they are organized together, then we have something that, you know, has worth independent of which formalism we use to assemble them. And I did totally buy into that vision. I didn't buy into his whole vision, but I did buy into that vision. The fact that there are many ways to formalize the logical relationships. There's many logical systems. I'm all too aware of that. And getting people to agree on one logical system to rule them all is part of the anti-goal. And it's still worthwhile to say, here are all the set of relevant arguments. And maybe, or maybe not, and this is part of what we are still haggling, separating them into pros and cons or contextual because of XOR is maybe it belongs in that layer or in another layer. But certainly the notion of, for example, which of the pros are linked, right? Which ones stand on their own, which ones are linked, and what are the sets of linkage is a whole debate in its own right. And if we could separate that from saying, well, here's the set of relevant arguments, let's at least agree on what that set is, independent of exactly the internal organization, internal structure of that set. So that separation of accepted. How much of how do we then go deeper into that is what we're still haggling. There was one specific structure that was proposed, which has some benefits that I'm still not buying, but I accepted some of the benefits about saying actually when, let's say C is derived from A and B. So we can say A supports C, B supports C, but A also supports the support of A to C. Sorry, B supports the support of A to C, and B supports the support of A to C. That was a diagram at the end. That one I'm still less than convinced because it would mean that if I'm haggling on whether B supports the link of A to C, I'm haggling on whether B is a direct argument or a meta argument, which feels wrong. It's anyway an argument. It doesn't suddenly become a meta argument. Anyway, please, or sorry, if I'm haggling on the link from B to C, then does that change it from a meta argument to an argument? No, I'm arguing whether it's a proper argument. That doesn't automatically make it a meta argument. So there's something that bothers me there. And also the other thing that bothers me is we need composites as conclusions. And this construction kind of gets away without composites. And we also need composites as conclusion. You know, A supports either B or C. Maybe both, maybe not, and that's another discussion. But it doesn't, that's a case. So we need composites anyway. That was in a way to get away without composites and without multi-premise. And no, that doesn't solve the problem.
Yeah, this also touches the whole equation and logic things.
Exactly.
Right? We didn't really agree on anything so far, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But certainly the notion that we want to be a bit more flexible. And one thing I did see finally that I didn't see is, oh, this is terrible because it becomes an n-squared structure, right? Because you have each premise has to go to the conclusion and also to all the other links. But I realized actually what I was proposing is to have subsets and argue this subset versus that subset. Well, that's a 2 to the n, which is even worse. So I need to have a way to reduce complexity on my side as well. Still working on that.
We should check to see who just came in. It looks like on the phone line.
Who just joined?
Hi guys, it's me. It's Tim. I'm in a car. I'm only going to be on for like 10 minutes, but I'll join while I can.
We're just rehashing. Marc-Antoine and Felix are politely catching me up, even though I've watched all the videos. It's still, the summary is good.
And I gave a few arguments why I'm still not happy with the last diagrams we left with. I see some values in it, but I'm still unhappy with it. But I don't have a full-fledged alternative yet. I was going to work on it this morning, and two meetings, and one friend call and one meeting just appeared in the morning. So yeah, the one thing I want to say is one function of the diagram is to get rid of compounds, but we still need compounds as conclusions. So that doesn't solve that problem. And we also, there's still something that bothers me about how arguing a direct claim could make a claim hover between claim and meta-claim, which also feels wrong. But I'd like to show that on the diagram. So phone is not the best way to do that. But I see issues with my construct, and so I don't have an alternative, full-fledged alternative yet. Sorry.
The whole concept of not labeling something as a pro or a con or was kind of shocking, but also kind of, it makes sense. And also we've talked about in the past that some statements, depending on how you interpret it or depending on your opinion on other things, they could be a pro or a con. So that kind of gets around that in this layer. But I'm resistant to it. But
actually, I have a question for Tim, if you don't mind. When I proposed what's, we had, we a few days ago, we asked what's the support really? And I said, oh, if A supports B, it means that you're believing in A makes you more likely to believe B than if you believe in not A. And then you replace it with greater or equal. And the more I think about it, the more that puzzles me to no end. Because if it's equal, then that's pretty much the definition of an irrelevant argument for me. If the belief in A or not A doesn't change at all your belief in B, that makes A irrelevant. So why did you insist on equal?
We may have mixed language there. Well, no, because A, what is it? A supports B is what we're saying, and if you believe in A, then it increases your belief in B. Right?
Yeah, and I'm saying strict increase.
It increases or leaves the same your belief in B. That's because you may not believe in the support. You can believe in A and believe that the support itself is invalid, in other words, irrelevant. And then it doesn't change your belief in B.
For me, I'm saying strict increase is the definition of believing in the support. It's the definition of agreeing with the support. What's the definition of the support? It means that if you believe the support, then the belief in A versus not A increases. Belief in A increases your belief in B strictly relative to not A, believing in not A.
Yeah, so Tim was thinking through the truth value, or what we used to call truth value.
Yeah.
Which is, yeah.
I have to get a phone call.
Okay, so that's not a point of divergence. Good. This one got resolved. That's useful.
One of the,
Yeah,
I was
go
just
ahead.
thinking through whether calling this the base layer makes sense,
Yes.
because it's not, I mean, it is a base because it is often the first step in the process, but like we were saying that there's not a necessity that other layers would be an exact subset of the other layer.
Or an
and all this
exact
other stuff.
refinement, yes.
Yeah, so yeah. And then I'm
Ma-
also thinking, when I build a system, am I gonna derive any value from transferring just this layer? Yeah, those are the thoughts that kind of came
Those
up
are
while we were
perfectly
discussing.
valid questions. The Stephen has pretty much persuaded me that systems that don't agree on refinements of the base layer can still derive value from just transmitting the base layer. So I'm willing to buy that, but I've been worried a bit that if I just get the base layer, will I do anything with it, or will I just reconstruct the whole thing because I want the next, my version of the refined layer? And I'm certainly would tend to believe that I would just dump it and start over. So
You mean like
yeah, the question of
duplicating work on a layer higher, right? That's what
Yeah.
you're saying. Yeah.
Yeah. The question of, does it add value to have that base layer? Yes, because it kind of directs me of which work I'd like to reduplicate, but I would certainly rebuild it from scratch. So I'm between, how much value does it add? Certainly, for me, it's not enough. But that was admitted. I mean, Stephen agrees with that. He's saying it has independent value, but of course we want the refined layers. So
And
certainly,
also synchronize them or transmit them, right?
Yeah. But yeah, he sees independent value in the base layers that I don't. But that's fine. I mean, it's valid. I certainly admit, and he did convince me that separating the disagreement is useful. Like if we want to disagree, is this relevant? Yes, no. Versus, is this, how is it relevant? And having that as a two-stage conversation is probably a good practice. That I got convinced of. In terms of progressive formalization, right?
But both still in the base layer, or?
No. That's kind of, for me, how I understand the separation between the layers. Like, does it belong in the set of, that's another thought I've been having, but this is very tentative. I've been using conjunctive normal form as the normal form very casually, right? But I'm thinking, for example, if we have A XOR B as supports C, or A XOR B or D supports C, right? The reality is A and B are then neither supporting nor opposing. They're contextual. And on the other hand, A XOR B becomes a lower level compound than the full compounds of the disjunctive normal form. That does become an unambiguous support. So do we want a kind of normal form where we assemble compounds that are minimally supportive? Minimal compound where you can say, okay, this combination is an unambiguous support or oppose. And so that we hide the ambiguous terms in compounds so that the compounds fit into a disjunctive normal form. But I'm not sure if I can do that canonically at all. So
and it still makes sense to humans.
And it still makes sense to you. Well, actually, yeah. I think that would make better sense to humans. I'm not sure it's canonical.
Probably not in all cases, I guess, but in many probably. But yeah. I always thought of that. It would be better if humans would structure which belongs together, which operation is applied here, and like build a whole tree of logic or a formula of logic that makes sense to that domain.
I hear you.
Yeah.
But and then we can use propositional calculus to check the equivalence of two formula. That works. But then the formula would be more intelligible. But certainly hiding the it depends, not hiding, but you see what I'm saying? Like grouping in a way that the contextual relevant claims become part of a clear support oppose is, I think, would raise intelligibility.
Can you give
Whenever
an
possible,
example for that? I don't fully understand it.
Well, that's the example I gave of the A XOR B or C. Sorry, it's an abstract one as usual, but it's easier to understand that A and not B, or B and not A, or C, which would be the disjunctive normal form.
Yeah, I've been often thinking that rather having links between each of the premises to say their relationship to each other is, grouping them down into their groups of relationships. So these are all the ands, these are all the ors, and then recombining them, with a conjunction. That's the way I'm leaning.
But we should still probably calculate the disjunctive normal form for canonicality signature calculation, if you will.
Yeah.
That makes sense, I guess. Yeah.
Well, yeah. Wouldn't there be multiple disjunctive normal forms or not?
The point of a normal form is it's unique.
Yeah, I mean the clauses don't have an order. That's what you mean, I guess.
Yeah.
Right.
Or you impose an arbitrary order, doesn't matter. That's the easy part. Yes.
Yeah.
But the point of a normal form is it's guaranteed unique. And even though there are many expressions, the normal form is unique. Now, of course, that's easy if you're dealing with prepositional calculus. And if you have, second and nth order logic or fuzzy logic or the kinds of community logics I'm working on, I'm not sure what the De Morgan's law looks in this case. I'll have to apply De Morgan's law to community logic. It'll be interesting.
I mean, De Morgan is just Boolean, right?
Exactly.
Only for Boolean algebra, yeah.
Yeah. Though I think in the case of community logic or even fuzzy logic, there is an equivalent. Fuzzy logic has a De Morgan-ish law.
Yeah.
It's fundamental enough that it carries in many logics, or doesn't. I don't think that you can apply De Morgan and intuitionistic. I don't remember. Maybe that's one of those that do carry over. My intuitionistic logic is getting weak.
So do we think everyone's agreed on the definition of support, or is that still under discussion? I couldn't tell if Stephen agreed.
I mean, honestly, when I asked the question, I expected something different, but I didn't know what to expect. And I think I agree with the definition, but I think the definition is not very helpful so far. I think helpful in the sense of helping to define the mapping that Tim is doing, for example, with mutual exclusion.
I left it intentionally open so that, for example, it would not entail a specific scoring mechanism, because we all agreed scoring has to be plug and play. So I defined it as, to be a valid scoring mechanism, it has to have this characteristic. And maybe it needs other characteristics. That's a possibility. I'm not close to that. But maybe there's some equivalent of triangle inequality or whatever. And certainly the belief is transitive. That's a poset. That's fine. That's not an issue.
I don't have access to the document here, but that is something we can talk about briefly, which is some of the other things I had noticed that essentially are heuristics for, if a scoring mechanism is right. One is that, any argument, any support done either improves the believability score or leaves it at 0, right? It never is a negative. can't argue in favor of something and have it be a negative. Another one is that, you know, it's not a linear relationship between multiple supporting arguments. Right. Which is that, you know, with the exception of sufficient arguments that are supposed to be absolute proofs, you know, if one argument increases your belief by 50% and another increases your belief also by 50%, it's not the same as 100. You can keep adding more and more reasons that will get you closer to 100% belief. But unless it's like a sufficient 100% proof, it's not, it can't go past 100% belief, right?
And here, I agree totally with that. And here, I believe that the real applicability is probably Bayesian law, if we have enough data to apply Bayesian law, which is probably the exception. But, you know, we'd want something that is Bayesian compatible, a kind of modal Bayesian rule or something like that. Like if you want to get into scoring, Bayes' laws should apply.
Yeah, I'm just thinking, I think my current reason score breaks a couple of the rules in the white paper for scoring.
Interesting.
So when we get to that point, it'd be interesting to discuss. Well, one of them is that the position of the claim shouldn't actually change the score. And I think Tim and I have discussed that. The positioning in mine is where the score is derived from, so it'll change. And also, as I've been going through realistic examples of this, I'm finding that it is more art than science in constructing the shape of the argument.
Absolutely. It's a fact.
Yeah. And I always knew there was some of that. It's just I'm updating my belief on how much of it is art, and it turns out it's like 90% art. So.
And this is why it's so important for me to have multiple representations and being able to compare them, being able to say, okay, you've come at this artistic rendition of an argument, and I've come at a different artistic rendition of the same argument. How do they how and where do they differ? For me, that's really an important question. And can we make this difference into an operational difference that we can argue about? Like, is there really a substantial difference between that rendition, that difference of rendition, and can we identify it?
And doing it through some sort of automated process, not manually, someone going through every claim in both of them and different.
Yeah, because humans are definitely not skilled at comparing similar arguments and seeing where exactly they would break down or differ. And this is, and I gave the example for definitions. I think if you have different concepts for a word, and you have basically conflicting definitions for a word or for a term, what you would want is to start giving either counterexamples or at least rules of this is something that would fit this definition and not this one. This is a distinguishing predicate between those two definitions. And I think that something analogous should be possible with conflicting arguments or formalizations of arguments. Do they differ and how? Is there a case that would agree with this rendition and not with that one? And can we identify such a case? Because I think this,
where do we know where these ambiguities in modeling an argument are? Because we just said that it's an art. There's no right way to do it. But if two people model the same argument and then Marc-Antoine, you say, okay, we could show the difference. Is that difference actually a different argument, or is it a different way of modeling it?
I'm sure both exist. I mean, we gave the example of the compounds and their normal form, where in this case, it's just a different way of modeling it. But I do think that there's definitely cases where it's a different arguments, and we want to separate those from the first cases.
And then we kind of need a normal form for arguments, right?
I have I'd like to discuss this more. I think it's a good conversation, but I have to go. So unfortunately, I'm not going to make any comments. I'll see what you guys record.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Bye, Tim.
I'd be very curious. I haven't thought about this as much in depth as I would. Certainly, there's difference in interpretation in when we discover implicit presuppositions. Jamie's notion of implied argument, like Doug Whistle's, for example, is extremely interesting. How do you interpret the claim? And sometimes there's much more to the claim. Like, is the claim ironic or not? It's a totally different. It's actually the negation of the claim made, right? When you do discourse analysis. And I think often a lot of the difference in interpretations will have to do with scope. I think he's, whoever made that claim was thinking in this scope. No, I think they're actually including this broader scope or this narrower scope. And this is all interpretation. But making scope explicit, making presuppositions explicit, those are all part of the formalization, right?
Making scope explicit is probably something where people find out, oh, I didn't actually know myself what I said. I was not so
absolutely
sure.
Absolutely.
And then arguments break down.
And this is exactly why it's so important to be able to say, oh, look, I said this, you said this. What scope did you mean? I don't know. What scope did I mean? I don't know. So, well, let's discover the proper scope of that claim. But if we both had a clue, it's interesting to see where do our clues differ and what does it entail, and so that we can harmonize.
Yeah. A bit back to the difference between two different models of argumentation. Doesn't that also touch the whole scoring rule that Bentley just mentioned from the white paper? That like the score should be independent of argument reordering and restructuring. Because have you seen any score that actually holds for that rule?
Well, not in how I do scoring. There are other scoring methods that might not be as sensitive to positions. I guess it comes down to where, can you create a set of rules that if you're operating in those rules, then but I think that means you have to have a more formalized rules on where you put the arguments. Maybe when we get into that, we could do some examples where some people would put the argument here and someone put it there.
With here and there, you mean like the support or the premise?
It's really more like, so I could say, so for the vaccine, I could say this study shows a high number of side effects. And if I put that in the top, under the top claim of saying you shouldn't take it, then that score has a heavier weight than if I put it down under a thing that says studies say, and then that's one of those studies. That changes the importance of, and part of in Gullybot and Reason Score is you are, where you choose to put the claim is you signaling how important that evidence is towards, that evidence should be to the belief in the system. So that's just a fundamental part of it. But other scoring systems, I guess that's one of the problems with the roll up, is that if you're rolling things up, any roll up system, I guess it depends on how you do that math though. There might be mathematical ways to not do it, but I think in the end, that's part of what you're expressing is where in the hierarchy of the claims is this, is the higher, the more important. Now, I'm of course saying top main claim at the top in child, I realize.
Okay.
In
So
the
entailment in the entailment structure.
yeah, in assuming what's the I can't even remember the name of that, of the most popular argument tree. Anyways, kind of standard argument tree,
Yeah.
So
the question of position is really interesting. Something we're speaking about structure. I'm remembering recently I was rethinking what is the fundamental difference between a claim and an argument. I mean, we know arguments are claims, but I realized most claims carry implicit supporting arguments. Like when we make a claim in a discourse, we kind of, I am be able to say that claim and put it as an argument for, as a premise for to support something else because it's supported in the common universe of discourse. And the claim is obviously not equivalent to its implicit support because somebody could give it a different implicit support and it would still be the same claim. But on the other hand, it does carry its baggage of implicit support when I enunciate it in an argument.
well,
So
right,
that I'm
so-
able to put it
yeah.
there in the first place. And then it's often brought to be supporting a previous claim or another claim that I've probably already enunciated. And again, that support is left implicit most of the time. We rarely say because blah, which is, well, we say because, but we don't say how this proves that, right? And there you're right, Bentley, that which of the many previous claims is it supposed to be support of? This is not something that a machine could know, right? This is something that a human has to interpret. And there are obviously variations of interpretation. Is it, high or low in the entailment net? High or low, or well, anyway, at differing positions in the entailment net, and probably at multiple positions in the entailment net, because the same claim can support many points, many other
So
claims.
yeah, so your question about the difference between a claim and argument, the way I think of it is the claim is the node and the argument is the graph.
No,
So just because a claim has supports doesn't make it an argument, right?
I agree. I agree. But I'm saying it's often like you're looking at a sentence and you're like, is it a pure claim, or is it actually standing for an argument? And the answer is almost always yes. It's in discourse, it's hard to isolate the claim from the argument when you look at a claim, because it's always comes with its implicit weight of argument in a text, in a given text.
Yeah.
But I agree, they're distinct. But what I'm saying is de-extricating that into the analysis.
There's normally an implied argument within every claim.
Yeah.
Most every claim.
Yeah. And that's in context. And so the whole relation between these contextual arguments we identify in context and try to interpret more formally, and the abstract decontextualized argument, it's plural for me because the argument is not the sentence. The contextual arguments each point to a different decontextualized argument, because the context is different enough that I think that the underlying argument concept is a different concept entity. So I would not unify them under one single decontextualized claim. I would have various decontextualized claims with this scope, with this entity, with this definition, with this.
Yeah, I think I agree with that.
I thought a bit more about this whole canonicality of modeling an argument, because we're kind of, our goal is to have a canonical way to look stuff up, and like a structure people agree on. And are there examples of arguments that are modeled in a different way? Because that would be very interesting to see, like, in which characteristics they usually differ, and can we do something about it model-wise?
Different way than what?
Yeah, when you say this, like we have a news article and someone extracted the argument structure and someone else also extracted the argument structure from the same article. Like how do they differ, even though both are accepted as being correct?
That's an interesting question. Certainly, there's a lot of people who have worked in argument structure, and most especially the group at Dundee, right? They've been using Walton's system and AIF, and they do a lot of argument mapping of real-time conversations. And because they're scientists and writing scientific articles, one thing, there is a statistical measure when you do qualitative analysis that measures whether different analysts agree on the classification of a statement. So you do, and a category that people tend to disagree a lot on is probably not a very good category. So in a way, they're validating their scheme by measuring the agreement rate of the analysts on the argument categories. And I have not studied those articles in them, but I've seen a few of them. Now they only stop at giving, the agreement rate, and it would be fascinating to get the raw data of, this analyst had this and this analyst had that. I don't think those are in the articles, but maybe it's worth asking for the data sets in this case.
They probably exist, yeah.
And they certainly do. But what I'm saying is, at least these data sets would be relevant to your question. Because since they've done the statistical analysis, I know they've had variant analysis of arguments using the Walton AIF schemas. So that would be absolutely interesting. Go ahead, go. I had an idea at this point.
I mean, it would also be interesting to get one of these people into our calls, because they probably have very strong or very strong opinions or good insights into what are the problems currently with what they're working with and how we could improve.
Walton's really been trying to make his system more formal, and there's a lot of fascinating, not only formal, but computational. And if you look at the intersection of computational models of argument schemes, there is a fascinating literature that I need to go back to. I just stumbled on one of those articles recently, and I'm like, oh my God, I need to go get back in depth on that. The article was did not totally convince me, but it was pointing to the fact that there's a literature there that I need to get deeper into.
That's great. And I guess we can learn from that, because the whole computational argumentation, people have to formalize stuff. And that's what we're after. Like, are there any useful formalizations or insights that we could use in our models?
Certainly, if you look at Walton's models, he's definitely working with multi-premise because he's assigning specific roles to different premises in certain arguments. In the classical syllogism, there was a notion of major and minor premise, right? Now in Walton's model, there's this plays this role, this plays that role, and goes much deeper into that because he gets different defeaters for different premises.
Very interesting. Would that be useful in human argumentation?
Oh, no doubt.
Wondering.
No, well, as long as it helps in identifying defeaters, I think it's useful. And it's one reason I've always thought about multi-premise naturally, even though I'm now accepting the value of compounds. But multi-premise still makes sense to me because of premise roles. But I also, decided to not go too deep in AIF and Walton's. I love it, with passion, but this is one case where people can disagree on which of the Walton schemes applies. And it's a perfectly fine and useful debate, but it's like, do I need this agreement on this to agree on the underlying agreement structure? Maybe not. It was something I was going to leave for a finer layer than the one I was working on. Because, yeah, it's useful, but it may be too fine for my purpose. So I did not exclude it, but I'm saying, what can I do without going at that level of detail, rather? But there's no doubt that it's useful. So this, we have a hierarchy of refinement here between Walton, me, and Stephen. I know that Tim is not tempted by multi-premise, so I suspect he's closer to my level than to Walton's. Clearly, he's interested in finer analysis than Stephen. Sorry. One thing I'm thinking about a lot is how much of the, if we're talking about claims and arguments as compounds, and we want canonicality, but one other principle of that would be even nicer than canonicality would be topology, right? Can we say how close two arguments are? Can we have a metric? Like there's some, if you look at, because I'm dealing with, because I'm speaking about this with Jamie, you know, in library science, the theme hierarchies have a topology. If two themes share a lot of the, are close in the hierarchy of themes, they're similar, they're related. And the closer they, the closer they are in the topology induced by the hierarchy, the closer the themes are as concepts. Now, we use, we can do the same, not with themes, but with entities. And there's all these ontologies, like RDF ontologies, or languages like IEML, are ways to impose a classification on entities which induces a topology. Now, we can lift that topology from the entities to the claims. The claims are close if the entities in the claims are close, including the predicate itself, because the predicate is an entity, if you will. So if we have predicate closeness and actor closeness, we can derive claim closeness, but not in a simple way. It's what happens when you have, different claims about the same entity or different entities in the same and different, like it's not clear, it's not linear, and I'm still thinking that through. And can I expand that to the argument closeness is totally an open question.
Yeah, sorry, isn't that the frames you mentioned basically? Yeah. And that's why
that's at the claim level, right?
Yeah, at the claim level.
Yeah,
but
also
entities
at the
and frames
level.
And frames are not, because they're not trivial. It's like a huge database. People have to come up with them. But yeah, I guess that's where it gets really complicated.
How do you lift an entity topology and a frame topology into a frame instance topology, like the topology of the frame, the abstract frames versus the frame instance, where here is this frame applied to those entities, and how do you go from one to the other? That's really something that I don't have a clear answer, but I'm sure there is one, and I'm sure it's a very useful one. And then lifting that, then it trivially lifts to arguments, actually. Well, trivially, if you have an argument topology. And Walton's argument schemes are kind of organized in groups. So that would give us a kind of basic argument topology. Is that the right topology for the arguments that would induce a nice topology? I don't know yet.
Could you explain, like in detail, at some point in the Walton's model, like in a session?
Well,
Or does it make sense? Everybody reads it individually.
no and no. Walton identifies 60 different argument schemes in his book, in his later book. There's about 30-ish in his first book that everybody has access to, that everybody knows, that's being formalized, and that's easy to find on the net. But his later book goes to 60, and that one you need to buy the bloody physical book because nobody wrote it all down. The Wikipedia page on argument scheme has like 40 of the 60 of the second book and says, oh, but some are here and some are here. And I need to just write them down at some point so I have them as a document. But you get, if you look at the list of schemes, some of them are very, very, very specific, right? And they go into subclasses. Subtypes of argument from popular opinion. Pop scheme, position to know ad populum argument, expert opinion ad populum argument, deliberation ad populum argument, common folks ad populum argument. These are all subtypes of the argument from popular opinion. That is already a subclass of, okay, no, that's a subclass of something else. The argument from position to know. That was number 4. And then 40, argument from commitment. Argument from danger appeal. Argument from need for help. These are all the larger categories. Ethotic argument. Pragmatic inconsistency. So these are the kinds of, so how, it's not a system, it's a list. It's a bit of a grab bag. There are systems in there. It's like, oh, you can classify it in this way or that way or that way. But the reality is there's too many, he lists many classifications of those arguments, but he doesn't, like basically there's many classifications. And he's saying, well, let me get the list because I think the list is important. And the beautiful work he does is saying for each of them, here are the defeaters. That is absolutely painstaking and useful work. But the question of what is the common structure to all of them, he lists a few, but he doesn't resolve it because it's quite complex.
But is that,
I'm
wondering, is this complexity arising from humans, or is just the domain itself that complex?
The domain is very heterogeneous, and many people have tried finding a unifying principle, but because of the heterogeneity, there's a lot of divergence on what is the right unifying principle. And here we get into the art versus, like basically unifying these things has proven to be very viewpoint dependent. And if I tried to do it, I'm sure I would end up with, for standard number 14. The question is there a way to think about them across these various schemes? That's something I want to do, but haven't gone through the exercise yet. It's a serious exercise and would be of undoubtedly high value. I'm not sure it's necessary for my purposes, so I haven't given it such a high priority. On the other hand, I do want to simplify this because it's a mess. 60 categories, which are, I think in some cases, too pointed. There should be abstracting generalizations. They must exist. But I'm afraid,
so.
What?
So it's interesting to see the logical fallacies broken down. Someone did put them in more of a hierarchy system. So there's like 4 main ones, and then it breaks down the smaller bits. That made it a lot easier to manage that huge list of hundreds of very specific and You know, some logical fallacies are big, and some are like, okay, you know, if the sky is blue and your left foot's on a green carpet, then that's a logical fallacy.
If you've seen such an organization, I'm curious. As I said, there's quite a few in the Walton's book, but
yeah, I mean, the logical fallacy is just a small subset of what the other ontologies are, right? I can.
I still buy Angenot's argument that fallacies are usually a kind of heuristic.
Yeah.
And they're fallacies as proof, but they're not fallacies as support necessarily. It's a fallacy to think it's an absolute proof, but it's not a fallacy to think it's a support. Now, of course, it's defeasible. It's defeasible reasoning. But it means that classifying fallacies is also classifying arguments. There's not a separate classification of fallacies and arguments,
right?
Or supports, that is.
It's just a term for a subset of, an arbitrary subset of that classification.
Well, those arguments which are not absolute proofs. Some of them are always false, mind you, but quite a small subset of the fallacies are always false. And that was Angenot's argument, and I think it's sound. On the other hand, identifying it's not an absolute proof is useful, and identifying where it can be defeated is absolutely useful for real life identification. So that way, anything, okay, that's the other thing. The abstractions I've seen, on the one hand, they help reduce the number, but they're so abstract that they're not necessarily easy to think about. And I'm not sure that, if people were to try to use them as classificatory, would that help? The advantage of the 60 fine-grained thing, I suspect that they're empirically, people agree on those more because they're fine-grained, they're easier to recognize than the abstractions. I may be wrong. But I'm really curious there. That's a hypothesis that I'd really like to see tested, because it's not just that I may be wrong. It's like, I would love for this to be wrong. If there are conceptual abstractions that are easy to grasp, that's a huge, 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 huge factor of success.
I mean, isn't our model that kind of conceptual abstraction?
I hope so. Yeah, but it abstracts away, for example, all of the Walton's work that helps find defeaters, which is useful work. It abstracts a lot away. I mean, we're not classifying fallacies. We're just saying this is the argument structure.
Right.
So all of that work is erased in what we've done so far. And certainly including it for me is not a goal, but again, as I said, making it possible to include it would be a goal. Like if we had a structure that made it really hard for somebody to add our Waltonian scheme classification, that would be a failure for me. Including Waltonian scheme or any scheme classification would be maybe out of scope, but allowing it would be in scope.
And it's not allowed right now?
Well, I do fear that if we, that's a whole question about what's a refinement, right? One of my resistance to the base layer was that, oh, the way I understand the base layer, and that's the whole question of the value of the base layer, if I were to try to do the refinement, I would redo all the work. And not only that, the way I would redo all the work would not be a refinement, but I may end up with a totally different structure. And that's really where it gets really wrong. If a totally different structure that may be mappable to the base layer, because the base layer is an erasure, but the question is it an erasure that is so different that, like, if I have, for example, the set of all relevant premises of a claim as a set, and then the refinement means I do a subdivision of this, that's fine, that's a refinement for me. But if we go into oh, we don't even create those sets, we just have these individual things, or we do the set one way in the base layer and the set the other way in the refined layer, that's wrong. For me, that's a failure of refinement. If we do it such that we have to impose a lot of, like refining structure as in creating subsets is fine, but if we do the other way around and we have to, well, regrouping may be fine too, because that could be superimposed. That's fine. Now it's really the intersection case that would bother me. And in the case of saying, oh, I'm giving finer roles, like, okay, I'm identifying a specific argument, so this would be finer than the whole subset that Steven's speaking of. This is a group. And in this group, well, I don't identify roles for the premises, and somebody comes up and adds here's the Walton category and here's the roles of the premises. That's a refinement. I'm okay with that. But if the doing the Walton category would end up doing the grouping differently, I got something wrong. You see what I'm saying?
I think so. I'm wondering if would these Walton categories, like the labeling of the premises, would that help to make the argument structure more canonical? Like, would different people come up with the same structure then?
That's a good question. I certainly mathematically, if you could be canonical about the Walton structure, you can erase the roles and be canonical with pure sets as opposed to role labeled edges. So I don't think that it adds canonicality that way. It adds distinctions, which is fine. But again, it's still possible that people are better at coming with the same groupings if they think in terms of Walton than if they think in terms of role erased arguments. In which case you would be, that, yeah, then that would answer your question positively. Like mathematically, no, but psychologically, perhaps.
Which would be very helpful for the system because like humans, of course, are curating the whole thing.
But on the other hand, it does require a much higher level of expertise to master Walton scheme. So it makes the system less accessible. And that's something that, like, you really need to be a trained logician to use Walton scheme. And that's why I've been, can I do something one step below that? That still has value.
But aren't some schemes like way more common than others? Probably.
There are very incomplete schemes that are very common. So I'm trying to find something that's an abstraction so that I'm not incomplete and unable to do some certain things, even though it's an erasure of useful details. But doesn't require the same level of training that, say, identifying Walton requires.
I'm gonna have to jump off.
Yeah, it's been an hour. It's been a bit rambling, yeah, but I still think it's been useful.
Yeah.
Should we publish it?
I think so.
Yeah, okay, good. As well. All right, thanks, guys. Bye.
Thanks.
Dan, thank you. Bye.
Thank you.